The Soviets put the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space 61 years ago, on June 16, 1963. In 2019, the New York Times ran an article titled, "How the Soviets Won the Space Race for Equality." The writer claimed that by putting not only the first woman into space, but also, many years later, the first Asian and first black man, the USSR signaled in unambiguous ways its commitment to equality. Well, not exactly. As The Atlantic retorted, the Soviet space program was not woke. The truth is that Tereshkova got to be the first woman in space because the Soviets were worried that the Americans would beat them to it. Had the Soviets known the truth, that NASA was way far from even entertaining the idea of female astronauts, much less letting one of them go to outer space, it's highly unlikely that Tereshkova would have gone either. She was a propaganda pawn and treated like one. To be fair, the Americans sent some confusing signals. The cover of the February 2, 1960 Look magazine posed champion airplane pilot Betty Skelton in a silver spacesuit in front of a Mercury capsule and asked, "Should a girl be first in space?" If the Soviets actually read the article, they should have realized that the answer was a resounding no. At Look's request, NASA had put Skelton through some of the same testing as Mercury 7 astronauts, who nickname her Mercury 7.5. It was for the magazine article, not a serious move toward training women astronauts. In her book, Almost Astronauts, Tanya Lee Stone notes that American women at the time couldn't rent a car or take out a loan without a male co-signer. They weren't allowed to fly fighter jets, let alone spaceships. One NASA official snarled at Skelton, "Women in space? If I had my way, I'd send them all out there." Still, a NASA doctor named William Lovelace, as an independent project on his own dime, recruited 25 women to go through the same astronaut training he conducted for NASA. 13 of them made it through. Years later, they'd be hailed as the Mercury 13, but NASA never seriously thought of taking them on, and this was as far as their astronaut training went. When the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev heard, erroneously, that the Americans were planning to put a woman in space, he declared, characteristically, that the Soviet Union had to do it first. Applications flooded in from some 800 women. It came down to 5 candidates who were sent to Star City, the Cosmonaut Training Center. It was effectively a fighter jock's secret clubhouse, where the misogyny was just as rife as at NASA. Offended and intimidated by the idea of letting women in, star cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin and the others were rude and condescending to them. Gagarin called them little tarts. He saw no use for them as cosmonauts. In June 1963, the Soviets launched 2 manned vehicles within 2 days of each other. Cosmonaut Valery Bykovsky flew in one, Tereshkova in the other. As they always did, the Soviets hid what a rough and troubled flight Tereshkova had. She got space sick, struggled with the manual controls, and skipped programmed chores. She complained about the lousy cosmonaut food and threw up some of it. As her wobbly flight dragged on, her communications with the men in ground control grew abrupt and testy. She complained about how uncomfortable her helmet and pressure suit were. She didn't like that for cleaning herself, she could only run a moist towelette over her face, and the towelettes weren't moist enough. It was later rumored, inevitably, that at least some of her discomfort and crankiness was because she was having her period in low gravity. Despite all that, Tereshkova spent more time in space, just shy of 3 full days, and made more orbits, 48, than all of the American astronauts put together at that point. She remains the only woman to fly a solo space mission. Around the world, Tereshkova's flight was hailed as a great leap forward for women, except, not surprisingly, in America. The response here was largely to wave it off as a publicity stunt. One newspaper dismissively referred to her as a cosmonette. Astronaut Scott Carpenter said that a chimp could do what she did. That a chimp could have done what he did too apparently didn't enter his mind. Privately, the directors of the Soviet space program held Tereshkova's achievement in similarly low regard. They were disappointed with her performance and jumped to the conclusion that women cosmonauts were a bad idea. His propaganda coup achieved, Khrushchev lost interest in the program and it was quietly terminated. It was nearly 20 years before the next female cosmonaut went into space in 1982. Still, that was quicker than the Americans, who didn't get around to putting a female in space until the following year, with physicist Sally Ride's mission on the Space Shuttle Challenger. It took 60 years for one of the Mercury 13 to finally go into space, sort of. Mary Wallace Wally Funk was 82 when she rode as a guest on Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin in July 2021. The 10-minute flight peaked at about 76 kilometers, shy of the 100 kilometers conventionally considered the edge of space, so technically none of the Mercury 13 had gone into space still. Tereshkova has gone on to a long career in Soviet and post-Soviet politics. As a member of the Russian parliament, she has been a stout supporter of Vladimir Putin and his nostalgia for the glory days of the Soviet Empire, and he in turn has touted her as a living avatar of that period. In 2020, she proposed an amendment to the Russian constitution that would allow Putin to evade term limits and remain in office until 2036. It passed. Putin's opponents in Russia denounced her as a puppet who helped him crown himself dictator for life. I don't even want to talk about these people who don't love the country, she shrugged.